All right, let's get into it. Today we're tackling one of the biggest, messiest, most controversial questions you'll find online. But we're not here to argue about feelings. No, we're going to investigate the very blueprint of the argument itself by looking at the science, the history, and the power behind the definition of one single word.
And the perfect place to start is with this powerful quote from the brilliant James Baldwin. He's saying, look, what's in someone's heart is less important than the results their systems produce, their laws, their banks, their schools. This idea perfectly shifts our focus from what an individual intends to what our institutions actually do. And that's exactly where we need to be for this conversation.
Okay, so here it is, the big question. This is the one that can make a conversation just completely blow up in an instant. And the reason why is pretty simple. Most of the time, people are actually answering two totally different questions because they're working from two totally different definitions.
And this slide right here, this is basically the whole debate in a nutshell. On the left, you've got the common, everyday definition. Racism is a personal feeling of hate. And by that definition, yeah, of course, anyone can be racist. But on the right, you have the academic definition used by sociologists. Racism is a system. It's prejudice plus power. For the rest of this explainer, we're going to investigate the evidence behind that second definition.
So to do that, we have to start at the very beginning, with the science. Before we could even talk about racism, we have to understand what race itself actually is. And honestly, this is where a lot of us are still running on some seriously old, outdated software.
The bottom line from modern science is overwhelming, and it's crystal clear. The racial categories we all use every day are social inventions. They are not, and they have never been, a biological reality. So let's break down why that is.
You see, in biology, for any species to be divided up into subspecies, or what you might think of as biological races, it has to meet these four very specific criteria. You need big genetic differences, really distinct traits, long periods of isolation, and very little mixing between the groups.
So, the big question is, do humans meet that checklist? And the answer, from scientists, is an unequivocal, absolute no. We fail on every single one. And this number right here, wow, this is the reason why. That 90 to 95%, that's how much of all human genetic diversity exists inside any single population group you could name. What that means is there can be more genetic difference between two people from, say, Norway than between one of them and a person from Nigeria. We're just too young and too mixed as a species to have ever developed biological races.
And to put an even finer point on it, check this out. The genetic gap between two types of wolves that live just down the road from each other is bigger than the gap between any two humans on opposite sides of the planet. Biologically speaking, we are all just one big, close-knit family.
Okay, so if nature didn't create these categories we call race, that means somebody had to invent them, which leads to the next questions. Who did it and why?
Well, the answer takes us all the way back to colonial America. See, in the 1600s, poor European workers and enslaved African workers were often in the same boat, working and living side by side. And when they actually united in a rebellion, the rich landowners got terrified. So they created a political tool to divide them, the legal identity of white. It was a strategy, plain and simple. Give one group of poor people special privileges to make sure they'd never, ever team up with the other group again. This was never about biology, it was about protecting the money.
And this invention was just one piece of a much larger, completely made-up system. The ruling class basically slapped color labels on entire continents of people to create a simple social and economic ladder. White was put at the very top to represent power, and every other group was slotted in somewhere below. Now, this new caste system, it wasn't just a friendly suggestion. Oh no, it was hammered into the very foundation of the country and enforced by law for hundreds of years. It literally became the American blueprint.
And this timeline, this is the paper trail. In 1669, a law made it okay to kill an enslaved person. In 1790, the country's very first citizenship law said only free white persons could become citizens. After the Civil War, you had black codes that basically found new ways to force black people into labor. Then came legal segregation with Plessy v. Ferguson. And even into the 1930s, the federal government itself was creating policies that systematically denied black families the chance to own a home. This is the system.
So, now that we've seen how science debunks biological race and how history built a social one, we can finally put all the pieces together and get to the definition at the absolute heart of this entire debate.
First up, let's define prejudice. Think of prejudice as an individual thing. It's a personal feeling, a bias, a stereotype. It's an attitude. And because any human being can have a negative attitude, any human being on Earth of any color can be prejudiced.
But racism in this framework is a whole different animal.
Racism is what happens when you take that personal prejudice and you plug it into the machine of institutional power. It's a system of group advantage that gets enforced by the very institutions we just saw, the courts, the government, the banks, to create and maintain that racial.
So the most important takeaway is this simple formula right here. According to the systemic definition, you can't have racism without both ingredients. Prejudice is the attitude, but power is the engine that enforces that attitude across an entire society. Without power, prejudice is still hurtful, but it's just prejudice.
This chart breaks it down perfectly. Prejudice works on an individual level. All it needs is a bad attitude, and its impact, while definitely harmful, is usually personal. Systemic racism, on the other hand, operates on a massive societal scale. It needs that attitude plus institutional power, and its impact is catastrophic. It literally changes the life outcomes for entire groups of people.
Okay, so what does using this definition actually mean for our original question? And maybe even more importantly, what are the big misunderstandings we need to clear up right away?
Let's be perfectly clear about this. Defining racism as a system does not mean that Black people are somehow morally better than anyone else. It does not mean they're incapable of hate or bigotry. It is absolutely not an excuse for anyone's bad behavior. And it for sure doesn't mean that personal prejudice doesn't cause real harm. It absolutely does.
The fundamental distinction is this. When a Black person shows prejudice, it can often be a defensive reaction to a system that has been targeting them for centuries. But when that system itself targets a Black person, it is simply functioning exactly as it was designed to. One is a response to the machine, the other is the machine.
And this all brings us to the logical conclusion of everything we've just looked at. Can Black people be prejudiced? Absolutely. Biased? Yes. Bigoted? Of course. But within the systemic definition of racism, they cannot be racist because they have never held the collective institutional power to invent a racial caste system, write it into law, and then use the full power of the state to enforce it on others. And that leaves us with one final and I think really important question. If we accept that racism is a system, something that was built piece by piece over centuries, then maybe the most important question isn't who can be racist, but rather who has the power and the responsibility to change that system? And that is a question for all of us to really think about.